Number 1. Gunung Padang, the retracted pyramid paper. Some discoveries are buried by dirt. This one was buried by the scientific process itself. On a hill in Cianjur, in West Java, Indonesia, there is a terraced arrangement of stone that sits about 885 meters above sea level. It is the largest megalithic site in Southeast Asia. 5-step terraces climb the slope, built from thousands of stacked columns of dark volcanic rock. Those columns are naturally hexagonal andesite basalt, formed as lava, cooled. And that single fact is the heart of the fight. Did people quarry and stack these columns? Or did nature make them, with humans adding only a thin layer on top? A geologist named Danny Hillman Nadawijaja, working for Indonesia's National Research Agency, argued something extraordinary. He claimed the hill was not just a megalithic surface. He said it was a buried pyramid, built in stages, with hidden chambers deep inside. In October of 2023, his team published this claim in the journal Archaeological Prospection. The paper stated that the deepest construction layer dated to between 27,000 and 16,000 years ago. If that were true, it would be the oldest monument ever built by human hands. It would predate Göbekli Tepe, which is about 11,600 years old, by more than the entire span of recorded history. Here is where it fell apart. The radiocarbon dates came from soil organic material inside drill cores. They did not come from tools, hearths, or worked stone. Archaeologist Flint Dibble, of Cardiff University, pointed out the obvious problem. Old soil is not evidence of old building. Ancient dirt can wash into a structure at any time. Within months, the publisher launched an investigation. In March of 2024, the paper was formally retracted for a major error in how the dates were interpreted. The retraction was unusual because the authors disagreed with it. Nadawijaja insisted the site was man-made and that his idea was being suppressed. His team had used ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and core drilling to argue for hidden chambers and cavities deep inside the hill. Back in 2014, the Indonesian government, under President Yudhoyono, had funded excavation there, which drew accusations that nationalism was steering the science. Mainstream geologists, meanwhile, including Sutikno Branto, argued the whole hill is simply the neck of an ancient volcano, with natural columnar jointing. The lost civilization angle was then amplified by figures like Graham Hancock and by the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. Conventional archaeology dates the visible terraces to roughly 2,500 years ago, consistent with other Indonesian megalithic cultures. So we are left with 3 readings. The fringe view says a lost Ice Age civilization is being hidden. The mainstream view says this is a genuine ancient site whose age was wildly overstated. The geological view says it is mostly a natural formation. But if a modern peer-reviewed paper can collapse this fast in public, what did earlier scientists get to quietly bury? The next truth was not written in stone. It was written in blood, inside the human genome. Number 2. The Yamnaya genetic replacement. About 5,000 years ago, a group of herders lived on the grasslands north of the Black and Caspian Seas. We call them the Yamneti, which comes from a word meaning pit, because they buried their dead in pit graves under earthen mounds called kurgans. The bodies were often stained with red ochre. These people mastered 2 technologies that changed the world. They herded horses, and they used wheeled wagons. Together, those gave them mobility across an ocean of grass. In 2015, 2 teams of geneticists, one led by David Reich at Harvard and one led by Eski Willerslev in Copenhagen, sequenced ancient DNA from across Europe. What they found rewrote the textbook. Around 4,500 years ago, people carrying Yamnaya ancestry swept west into Europe. In Britain, the effect was staggering. Steppe ancestry replaced something like 75 to 90% of the existing gene pool within a few centuries. The Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge were, genetically, almost erased. Then came the truly unsettling part, when researchers compared the Y chromosome, passed father to son, with mitochondrial DNA, passed mother to child. The two told different stories. The incoming male lineages spread far more than the female ones. This is called sex-biased replacement. Around this same transition, geneticists documented a collapse in male genetic diversity worldwide, sometimes called the Y chromosome bottleneck. In plain terms, across large regions, the local men stopped contributing to the future. The migration is tied to the spread of the Indo-European languages, the root family behind English, Hindi, Russian, and most European tongues. This revived an older idea, the Kurgan hypothesis of Maria Gimbutas, now confirmed in the DNA. The Central and Northern European corded ware culture turned out to be about 75% steppe-derived. In fact, modern Europeans are a blend of three ancient populations: Western hunter-gatherers, early Anatolian farmers, and these Yamnaya-related herders. The story also connects to disease. Simon Rasmussen found early plague bacteria, Yersinia pestis, in Bronze Age steppe individuals. Perhaps sickness cleared the land before the herders arrived. Christian Christensen has suggested organized bands of young men and institutionalized violence. But critics are careful here. DNA shows outcomes, not methods. It proves a demographic result. It does not prove a massacre. Isotope studies at the Lech Valley in Germany show that women moved between groups, marrying out, which complicates any simple picture of conquest. The language of replacement and elimination is also politically radioactive, which makes it fraught to publish plainly, so we hold three possibilities together: violent conquest, disease-driven collapse, gradual assimilation. The steppe left behind mounds, but another culture, far to the south, left something far harder to look at: a building filled with skulls. Number 3. The Çayönü Skull Building. In southeastern Turkey, near the upper Tigris, lies a village that was old before farming was old. Çayönü Tepesi was occupied between roughly 8,600 and 7,000 years before the Common Era. It was excavated starting in 1964 by Robert Braidwood of the University of Chicago and Halit Sambel of Istanbul University. The site is famous for early architecture, including experimental grill plan and cell plan buildings, and for some of the earliest working of native copper. Its people were among the first farmers cultivating emmer wheat and lentils, but Çayönü is remembered for one structure above all. Archaeologists call it the Skull Building. Inside this building, they found the remains of an estimated 400 or more individuals. Many were represented only by their skulls, stacked in vaults and cells, alongside disarticulated long bones. This was secondary burial, where the dead were processed and their bones curated. In the center sat a large polished limestone slab, weighing about 60 kilograms. It looked like an altar. And when researchers ran residue analysis, the results were chilling. The slab and a nearby flint knife tested positive for human blood. They also carried the blood of aurochs, the wild cattle of the ancient world, and of sheep. That combination led some scholars to a dark interpretation. The building may have been a place of ritual killing or ritual defleshing of the dead. Human death was linked with cattle, a pairing that echoes across the Neolithic world. Çayönü fits a wider pattern that archaeologists call the skull cult. You see it at Göbekli Tepe, at Jericho, at Ain Ghazal. The dead were not simply buried and forgotten. Their heads were removed, kept, and displayed. Now, for the honesty this deserves. The skull deposits built up over many phases, not in a single terrible night. Wild bull skulls, called bukrania, were part of the ritual, echoing the imagery at Çatalhöyük. And the blood residue methods used in the 1980s and 90s have real reliability concerns. So skeptics push back. Perhaps this was an ancestor cult where skulls were venerated, not a slaughterhouse. We are left with three readings: a mortuary, an ancestor cult, a site of genuine ritual killing, or misread contaminated residue over ordinary secondary burial. What is certain is that monumental ritual arrived with the first villages not long after them, and at the next site the dead did not merely leave their skulls behind, they left their faces. Number 4. The Ain Ghazal buried Plaster people. On the edge of Amman, the capital of Jordan, road construction once cut into one of the largest villages of the ancient world. The site is called Ain Ghazal, the Spring of the Gazelles. It was occupied between about 7,200 and 5,000 years before the Common Era. At its height, it may have covered 15 hectares and held around 3,000 people, several times larger than contemporary Jericho. Excavations began in 1982, led by Gary Rolifson and Zaidin Kafafi. Then, in 1983, and again in 1985, the diggers found something that looks like it belongs in a nightmare and a museum at the same time. Buried in pits beneath the old floors were caches of human statues. They are about 9,000 years old, among the oldest large-scale human figures ever made, standing up to a meter tall. They were built on frames of bundled reeds coated in white lime plaster. Their eyes were outlined in black bitumen, giving them a wide, staring gaze. And some of the figures have two heads, a single body with two faces. No one knows what that means. Twins, perhaps, deities, ancestors. The statues were not thrown away. They were carefully laid down and buried as if in a closing ceremony, a deliberate decommissioning. The same site produced plastered human skulls, part of that same Levantine skull cult where the heads of the dead were coated in plaster and given new faces. The abstract style, with huge eyes and minimal bodies, tells us these were symbolic objects, not portraits. By firelight, with those bitumen-rimmed eyes, they may have seemed almost alive. The village itself sat at a hinge point in history spanning the transition from the pre-pottery to the pottery Neolithic, and its people were already domesticating goats and growing cereals and legumes. Ghazal also tells a cautionary tale. Rolfsson described what he called a Neolithic hangover. The growing village cut its forests, exhausted its soil, and eventually declined. The two statue caches were buried about 200 years apart, showing this was a lasting tradition, not a single event. Today the figures are split between the Jordan Museum in Amman and institutions abroad, and they have toured the world as icons of the Stone Age. Were they ancestors, deities, teaching objects, or a forgotten pantheon? We can only guess. Images clearly came before writing. But there is a heretical claim that writing itself began in a place no textbook wants to admit. Number 5. The Tărtăria tablets and the Vinča signs. In 1961, an archaeologist named Nicolae Vlasi was digging at Tărtăria. In Transylvania, Romania, he found 3 small clay objects. 2 were rectangular, 1 was round, and 2 of them were covered in incised signs. They were pierced with holes, as if meant to be worn or hung. The objects came from a pit belonging to the Vinča culture, a Neolithic society of the Balkans that flourished between about 5,700 and 4,500 years before the Common Era. The marks on the tablets resemble a wider set of symbols found on thousands of Vinča artifacts, sometimes called the Danube script or the Old European script, and here's the claim that set the field on fire. If the tablets are as old as the layer around them, some argue they date to about 5,300 years before the Common Era. That would make them older than Sumerian cuneiform by roughly 2,000 years. In other words, writing may not have started in Mesopotamia. It may have started in Neolithic Europe. You can see why this is hard to publish calmly. It threatens a foundational story of civilization. Maria Gimbutas embraced the idea, folding it into her vision of a peaceful, goddess-centered old Europe. The linguist Harold Harman has argued the Danube script is the oldest writing tradition on Earth. But most epigraphers are unconvinced. To count as true writing, a system must encode spoken language, and there is no evidence these signs do. There are no bilingual texts, no long inscriptions, and no continuity into any later script. There is also a dating problem. The excavation records were criticized, and some suspected the tablet slipped down from a later layer. Radiocarbon dates came from associated bones, reportedly the disarticulated and possibly burnt remains of an adult in the same pit, so the extraordinary age cannot be firmly proven. Yet the Vinča culture itself was genuinely advanced, with large tell settlements, fine pottery, early copper metallurgy, and figurines by the thousands. Whatever the tablets are, they may represent an early notation system, a genuine step toward writing without quite being writing, perhaps used for record-keeping or ritual. And they are not alone. A similar inscribed tablet from Dispilio in Greece dates to around 5,200 years before the Common Era, hinting at a wider Balkan tradition of marking that no one fully understands. So we hold 3 views. This is proto-writing, this is the earliest true script, or these are undatable intrusive objects. From marks that might be words, we turn to a civilization that was drowned before the world would believe it existed. Number 6. Liangzhu, the drowned Jade civilization. For most of the 20th century, textbooks said Chinese civilization was about 3,000 years old and born along the Yellow River in the north. The Yangtze Delta in the south was treated as a backwater. That story was wrong. In the wetlands near modern Hangzhou, a society called Liangzhu flourished between about 3,300 and 2,300 years before the Common Era. It was first identified in 1936, but its true scale was only understood in this century. Liangzhu was a state. Its walled city covered around 300 hectares, and the wider settlement system spanned roughly 100 square kilometers. Most astonishing of all was its water engineering. Before 3,000 years before the Common Era, the Liangzhu people built one of the earliest and largest hydraulic systems in the world, a network of high dams, low dams, levees, and reservoirs that managed the seasonal flooding of the local river. This was infrastructure on a scale no one expected from a Neolithic society. At the heart of the city stood the Mojiaoshan platform, an artificial earthen mound covering some 30 hectares, which served as the ceremonial and administrative center. Their elites were buried with breathtaking quantities of jade. There were kong, which are square tubes, bai, which are flat discs, and yu, which are axes. Many were carved with an intricate monster mask motif. Remember, they had no metal tools. They shaped this hard jade to sub-millimeter precision using only abrasives. In 2019, UNESCO inscribed Liangzhu as a World Heritage Site, formally recognizing it as evidence of a 5,000-year-old Chinese state. Then, the city vanished. In 2021, a study in science advances, led by Haiwei Zhang with Hai Cheng and Lawrence Edwards, used uranium-thorium dating of cave stalagmites and site sediments to pin the collapse to around 2,300 years before the Common Era. The cause appears to have been catastrophic monsoon flooding. A thick layer of clay and river sediment simply buried the city. The society showed sharp inequality, with jade-rich elite tombs beside bare commoner graves, and it stored huge quantities of rice in granaries. It had no bronze. Its power rested on jade, rice, and the control of water. Was the end climate-driven flood, internal breakdown, or conquest? The flood layer makes climate the leading suspect, and while one delta drowned, far to the west, a desert was raising stones toward the stars. Number 7. Nabta Playa, the desert calendar circle. Today it is one of the driest places on Earth, but the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, about 100 kilometers west of Abu Simbel, was once a land of seasonal lakes. During a wetter era, known as the African Humid Period, between roughly 11,000 and 5,000 years ago, cattle herding people lived here. The site is called Nabta Playa, and it was studied for decades by Fred Wendorf and Romuald Schild, with archaeoastronomy by J. McKim Malville. These herders were not simple wanderers. They dug deep walk-in wells to reach water, they arranged their camps in orderly lines, and they built stone monuments. The most famous is the Calendar Circle, a ring of upright sandstone slabs about 4 meters across, with pairs of stones forming gates. In a 1998 paper in the journal Nature, Malville and colleagues argued that some of these alignments marked the sunrise of the summer solstice. For herders, that moment mattered because it coincided with the return of the life-giving rains. There is more than the circle. Larger stone alignments stretch across the landscape, along with sculpted bedrock, forming a ceremonial complex. And then there are the cattle. Whole cows were buried in clay-lined roof chambers beneath stone mounds. These animals were treated almost like royalty, a genuine cattle cult. The megalithic phase dates to roughly 7,000 to 6,500 years ago, which makes it older than Stonehenge. The stones were hauled from a kilometer or more away, proof of organized labor. There is a real possibility these cattle herders domesticated cattle independently in Africa, and their seasonal gatherings show planning and social coordination far beyond simple survival. Wendorf and Malville argued that this tradition may have fed into the later civilization of the Nile Valley. When the monsoon failed around 5,000 years ago, the Sahara dried out, and its people moved toward the river, plausibly helping to spark dynastic Egypt. Some of the megaliths were eventually moved to the Nubia Museum in Aswan for preservation. Skeptics offer a fair caution. With many stones and many possible sky targets, some alignments can appear by chance and must be tested carefully. So the readings range from a genuine pastoralist observatory to overstated alignments to a lost Proto-Egyptian culture. Either way, African herders were tracking the heavens long before the pharaohs. The Old World has many famous firsts, but the Americas were hiding a city just as ancient. Number 8. Caral, the oldest city in the Americas. In the Supe Valley of Peru, about 200 kilometers north of Lima, and 23 kilometers inland from the Pacific, stand the ruins of a city that should not have existed so early. Caral is the flagship of the Norte Chico civilization, and it dates to between about 3,000 and 1,800 years before the Common Era. That means it was rising at the same time as the pyramids of Egypt and the first cities of Sumer, yet it arose in near total isolation in the New World. The Peruvian archaeologist Ruth Shady Solis began excavating Caral in the mid-1990s, and radiocarbon dates published in 2001 with Jonathan Haas and Winifred Creamer confirmed its astonishing age. The city covers about 66 hectares and holds 6 large platform mounds. The greatest, the Pyramid Mayor, rises about 18 meters, on a base measuring roughly 150 by 160 meters. And here's what unsettles the usual story of early states: there are no fortifications, there are no weapons, there is no clear evidence of warfare or violent death. Shady describes a society organized around trade and religion, not war. Its economy was a partnership. Coastal fishers caught anchovies and sardines. Inland farmers grew cotton, which was turned into nets and traded back to the coast for fish. Caral had no pottery and no writing, yet it built monuments, which upends the assumption that ceramics and script must come first. A knotted string found here may be an early quipu, the Andean recording device thousands of years before the Inca. 32 flutes made from condor and pelican bone reveal organized music and ritual performed in sunken circular plazas. The textile and gourd art of the region carries the earliest images of the staff god, a deity whose imagery would echo through Andean religion for the next 4,000 years. But peaceful does not mean gentle. Excavations have found infant and child remains associated with buildings. At the coastal partner site of Aspero, Shady's team reported a sacrificed infant wrapped and buried as a dedicatory offering in a foundation. Ritual death was still present. The civilization declined around 1,800 years before the Common Era, linked to El Niño flooding and drought that broke the fishing and farming balance. There is even a modern dark footnote. In 2003, Ruth Shady was shot at while defending the site from looters and land interests. Some disturbing truths are not about the dead at all. They are about who is allowed to study them. Number 9. Kennewick Man, the skeleton they fought to bury. In July of 1996, 2 young men watching a boat race waded into the Columbia River near Kennewick, Washington, and found a human skull. At first, police thought it might be a recent murder victim. It was not. The nearly complete skeleton was about 9,000 years old. An anthropologist named James Chatters made an early assessment describing what he called Caucasoid-like features. That single phrase would poison the next 20 years. Embedded in the man's right hip was a stone cascade spear point healed over. He had been wounded, and he had survived. Under a United States law called NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, several Columbia Basin tribes, including the Umatilla, claimed the remains as an ancestor and asked to rebury him. But a group of 8 scientists, including Douglas Ousley of the Smithsonian, sued to allow study. The case became known as Bonnickson versus United States. It dragged on for years. In 2004, a federal appeals court ruled that the remains were too old to establish a clear link to any modern tribe and permitted scientific study. The case became a landmark in the ethics of American archaeology. It pitted scientific inquiry against indigenous rights and religious belief, and in the meantime, those early claims about non-native features were seized upon by fringe groups who used them to argue that Europeans had reached America first. Then, in 2015, genetics settled it. A team led by Eska Willerslev sequenced Kennewick Man's genome and found that he was more closely related to modern Native Americans than to any other population. The DNA specifically matched the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. Morphology had misled everyone. The skull shape had suggested an outsider. The genes proved an ancestor. The case reshaped how Nagprekir and tribal consultation handle ancient remains across the United States, becoming a permanent landmark in the law as well as the science. Following a federal determination in 2016, the tribes reburied the man they call the Ancient One in February of 2017. Isotopes showed he had eaten a marine diet, suggesting a coastal traveler, which supports the idea that people first entered the Americas along the coast. He was robust, about 40 years old, roughly 5 feet 7, and marked by many healed injuries. To the tribes, he was never a specimen, but the Ancient One, and he became a symbol of the tension between 2 ways of knowing the past, science on one side and oral and spiritual tradition on the other. In the end, the two agreed. For years, broadcasts had implied Europeans came first, a story later shown to be wrong. And one remote island turned the whole idea of civilizational collapse into a cautionary tale about the story itself. Number 10. Rapa Nui, Easter Island. Far out in the southeastern Pacific, about 3,500 kilometers west of Chile, lies one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, was settled by Polynesian voyagers who crossed open ocean by canoe. The date is debated, but researchers like Terry Hunt and Caral place it around 1200 years of the Common Era, later than older estimates. On this small island, people carved nearly 1,000 moai, the great stone statues, from volcanic tuff at the Reinu Raraku quarry. Some stand over 10 meters tall and weigh dozens of tons. For a long time, the biggest mystery was how they moved them. Hunt and Lipo showed that a moai could be walked upright, rocked side to side with ropes by small teams. This matched the island's own oral tradition, which always said the statues walked. But the island holds a deeper mystery still. It is called Rongorongo, a system of glyphs carved into wooden tablets. It is unique to Rapa Nui, and after more than a century of effort, it remains undeciphered. Only about 24 genuine Rongorongo objects survive anywhere in the world. In 2024, radiocarbon dating of a tablet held in Rome suggested one piece might date to before European contact, reviving the debate over whether the script was invented independently. Then there is the story of the fall. Jared Diamond, in his 2005 book Collapse, popularized a grim model. The islanders cut down their forests, wrecked their environment, descended into warfare and even cannibalism, and destroyed themselves. He called it ecocide. But Hunt and Lipo challenged this hard. Much of the deforestation, they argued, was driven by Polynesian rats eating palm seeds, and the population stayed relatively stable until outsiders arrived. The true catastrophe was external. In 1862 and 1863, Peruvian slave raids struck the island, followed by smallpox. The population crashed to about 111 people by 1877. The famous Birdman cult, centered at Orongo, came later, involving a yearly race to retrieve the first sooty tern egg from a nearby islet. The Moake were toppled over time, perhaps in conflict, perhaps as beliefs changed. Genetic studies still debate whether Rapa Nui had contact with South America before Columbus, with some finding traces of Native American ancestry and others disputing the timing. The disturbing truth here is not a lost race or a curse. It is how easily the story of a whole people can be mistold, turned into a parable of self-destruction that may be unfair to them. And their script, Rongorongo, still holds its silence, an entire tradition of thought locked away, perhaps forever. Look back across these 10 cases and a pattern emerges. Each of these truths was delayed, denied, retracted, or reframed. Gunung Padang was retracted. Kennewick man was litigated and repatriated. Rapa Nui was quietly revised from parable to injustice. The reasons repeat, and they are worth naming. Nationalism shapes archaeology everywhere. Indonesia funded the Gunung Padang dig with political fanfare. Romania has a national stake in the Tărtăria tablets. China's textbooks long centered the north, leaving Liangzhu underappreciated for decades until UNESCO reversed that neglect. The past is never just about the past, it is about who gets to claim it. Then there is the machinery of science itself. The rule that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence protects us from nonsense, but it can also harden into orthodoxy that resists genuine surprises. Ancient DNA made this worse and better at once. It gave us facts, but it also gave us words like replacement and elimination, words that are politically radioactive, which makes careful scholars hesitate before speaking plainly. There's also the matter of recognition and reversal. For decades, Liangzhu was underappreciated because orthodoxy placed the earliest Chinese states in the north, along the Yellow River. It took UNESCO recognition in 2019 to formally overturn that neglect and validate a 5,000-year-old southern state. Recognition can come late, and it can come at real personal cost. Ruth Shady faced threats and even a shooting incident while protecting Caral from looters and land interests. These are not abstract debates. People take risks to tell these stories. Some findings unsettle cherished myths. Skull cults and blood-stained altars destroy the comfortable image of a gentle, peaceful Neolithic. Foundation burials at Caral complicate the story of a civilization without violence, and the question of who wrote first threatens a foundational tale of human progress. Meanwhile, the methods have real limits. Blood residue analysis from the 1980s is imperfect. Soil dates can mislead. That legitimate uncertainty leaves gaps, and fringe media, from popular books to streaming documentaries, rush to fill those gaps with sensation. A headline wants a pyramid, a genocide, an ecocide. The truth is usually more complicated than a headline can hold. Beneath all the controversy, though, these societies shared real and specific things. Strip away the arguments, and these scattered peoples, separated by oceans and thousands of years, turn out to share a striking set of features. The first is monumental building without metal tools. Liangzhu shaped jade to sub-millimeter precision with abrasives. Caral raised 18-meter pyramids. Nabta Playa hauled megaliths across the desert. None of them needed bronze to do it. The second shared feature is the preoccupation with the human head. Skull curation runs from Çayönü in Anatolia to Ghazal in the Levant, where the dead were given plaster faces. The third is cattle. From the aurochs' blood on the Çayönü altar to the buried cows of Nabta Playa, wild and domestic cattle carry deep symbolic power. The fourth is the dedicatory burial, the practice of placing a body, often an infant, into the foundations of a building, seen at Caral and its coastal neighbor Ospero. There is more. Astronomy structured ritual life, most clearly at Nabta Playa. Status was signaled through jade, plaster, gold, and stone. Water control and irrigation produced the surplus that made power possible. Trade linked coast and interior. Writing, or something reaching toward it, emerged independently in the Vinča signs, in Rongorongo, and in the incised marks of Liangzhu. Social hierarchy shows plainly in the gap between rich and poor tombs. An ancestor veneration blurred the boundary between the living and the dead in nearly every case. Music and performance were part of statecraft too, as the bone flutes of Caral remind us. And in nearly every case, symbolic art came before writing and outlived it. The deepest lesson is independent invention. These features did not spread from one origin point outward. They arose again and again, on their own, wherever human societies grew complex. Caral and Rapa Nui, born in isolation, prove that civilization is not a single family tree. It is a pattern that human beings keep rediscovering. The old framing of a primitive past simply collapses under the weight of this evidence, which raises the next question. If these societies rose independently, why did so many of them fall? The endings, like the beginnings, rhyme. Liangzhu drowned under monsoon flooding around 2,300 years before the Common Era, its city sealed beneath clay. Caral declined amid El Niño flooding and drought around 1,800 years before the Common Era, as the delicate balance of fish and cotton broke. Ghazal suffered what Gary Rolfson called a Neolithic hangover, cutting its forests and exhausting its soil until the great village faded. Nabta Playa emptied when the African monsoon failed and the Sahara returned to desert. Rapa Nui lost its palm forest over centuries, rats and people together. Climate is the recurring executioner, but it is rarely the only cause and rarely a clean one. Disease lurks in the background, from the plague found in Yamnaya, eerie steppe people, to the smallpox that devastated Rapa Nui. And collapse itself is often misunderstood. It is usually not total disappearance, it is reorganization. When Nabta Playa dried, its people did not simply die. They moved to the Nile and may have helped build Egypt. Continuity ran through migration. The modern parallels are hard to ignore. Sea level rise threatens low-lying deltas today, just as flooding erased a delta civilization 5,000 years ago. The Yangtze Delta that drowned Liangzhu is home to tens of millions of people now, in one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. Overexploitation of soil and forest is an ancient and a present danger, and the Neolithic hangover that Gary Rolfson described at Ghazal, deforestation followed by erosion followed by decline, is a sequence playing out in parts of the world today. The contested ecocide model of Rapa Nui may be too simple, but the ecological pressures it points to were real. And sometimes the worst blow comes from outside, as slave raids proved on Easter Island, striking harder than any internal failure. Resilience varied from place to place. Some societies absorbed shocks and reorganized, others shattered outright. The lesson is that complex societies are most fragile at the margins of climate, where a shift in rainfall or a rise in the sea can undo generations of building. What makes these collapses knowable is science. Uranium-thorium dating of stalagmites and radiocarbon dating of sediments let us time these endings with real precision. The sediment layers record catastrophe in clear bands of clay. What once looked like unexplainable mystery often turns out to be measurable environmental stress written in the ground. Yet for all we can now measure, there is knowledge these civilizations took with them that we may never recover. For every question these sites answer, they raise several more, and some of those answers may be gone forever. Rongorongo remains undeciphered. An entire tradition of Rapa Nui thought sits silent on a handful of surviving tablets, many of the others destroyed in the 1860s. The Vinča signs may or may not be language, and without a bilingual key we may never know. Liangzhu had no readable script, so its politics must be reconstructed from tombs and dams alone. The uncertainties run through every case. We do not know what the two-headed statues of Ghazal meant. We do not know for certain whether the Çayönü altar saw sacrifice or veneration. Even after the retraction, the true age of Gunung Padang is still argued. We cannot yet say whether the Yamnaya expansion was driven mainly by violence or by disease. It is statistically contested whether Nabta Playa's alignments were truly intentional, and the question of pre-Columbian contact at Rapa Nui remains genetically disputed. Some of these gaps will close. New tools keep reopening old cases. Ancient DNA, stable isotopes, and precise dating have already overturned things scholars once considered settled, and the pace of discovery is accelerating. A skeleton like Kennewick man was studied for nearly 20 years before its genome finally spoke. A civilization like Liangzhu waited most of a century for its true importance to be understood. The tools we lacked yesterday routinely answer the questions we could not touch before. But some gaps may never close. Decipherment of a script like Rongorongo may be impossible without a bilingual key, some Rosetta Stone that pairs the unknown glyphs with a known language, and no such key exists. Oral traditions preserve knowledge that science struggles to verify, and the two ways of knowing do not always translate. Objects excavated a century ago lost their context in the digging, their exact positions and associations never recorded. Looting and destruction erase data permanently with no backup. The honest principle is humility. Absence of evidence is not proof of simplicity. When we cannot read a script or explain a ritual, that silence reflects the limits of our tools, not the limits of the people who left it behind. Which brings us to why any of this should matter to you at all. Here's the thread that ties these 10 truths together. Too disturbing to publish very often means too complex to simplify. Every case in this video was revised, retracted, litigated, or reframed, and that is not a failure of knowledge. It is knowledge doing what it is supposed to do. When the Gunung Padang paper was retracted, the system was working, not breaking. When DNA rewrote the peopling of Europe and the Americas within a single decade, that was science correcting itself in real time. The old comfortable myths did not survive contact with the evidence. The gentle Neolithic gave way to skull cults and blood-stained altars. The idea that civilization spread from one cradle gave way to cities rising independently in the Americas and monuments to the stars built by African herders. The parable of a people who doomed themselves gave way to a harder truth about raiders and disease arriving from outside. Consider how much changed in just a few decades. A generation ago, the textbook said European populations had been broadly continuous since the Ice Age, that the earliest writing was Mesopotamian, that Chinese civilization was 3,000 years old, and that Easter Island was the definitive story of ecological suicide. Every one of those statements has been revised, complicated, or overturned, not by cranks or conspiracy theorists, but by careful work with new methods, published and then argued over in the open. In each case, the story we told about the past turned out to reflect the politics of our present. There is a reason discomfort keeps appearing in these stories. Discomfort is a signal. It marks the exact places where our assumptions were wrong. These civilizations were sophisticated, spiritual, and fragile, and what unsettles us most is how much they resemble us, in their hunger for power, their rituals around death, and their vulnerability to a changing climate. The record is incomplete, and that should keep us curious rather than certain. New tools will overturn things we believe today just as surely as we overturned the beliefs of a generation ago. We should also honor the people behind the artifacts, not just the mysteries that surround them. Behind every skull, every jade disc, every staring plaster face, there were living human beings with beliefs and fears as real as our own. The past is not a fixed textbook. It is an argument still in progress. And the most disturbing truth of all is simply this. It shows us how easily the story of an entire people can be mistold, and how much patient, careful work it takes to tell it right. That work is never truly finished, and it belongs to all of us who choose to keep looking.